Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is Dr. Lubna from Anatomy Department, PGMI Amiruddin Medical College. Now, after discussing the important anatomical landmarks of external ear and middle ear, today we're going to discuss the features of the internal ear, which is the third and the last part of ear. Now, the internal ear is also called a labyrinth. Literally speaking, a labyrinth means a complicated, irregular network of passages or paths in which it is difficult to find one's way. Internal ear is called a labyrinth because it is a complicated, irregular, and complex network of intercommunicating fluid-filled bony cavities containing membranous ducts and sacs serving the function of hearing as well as balance. Now, first of all, we're going to discuss the location of internal ear. As you can see in this diagram, the internal ear is buried deep in the petrous part of temporal bone. As you can see, in this diagram, we've shown you the petrous temporal bone. And here in this diagram, you can see an enlarged version of that part. Talking about the axis of this diagram, this is the anterior, this is the posterior, this is medial, this is lateral. As you can see here in this inbox, we've seen that the petrous part of temporal bone have been enlarged to show the location of internal ear. This is the internal acoustic meatus, and this is buried deep in the petrous part of temporal bone. Okay. This is another diagram showing the location of internal ear from the superior view. As you can see, the cranial cavity have been shown in the small left hand corner, and this is the auricle, external auditory meatus, and these two make up the external ear. Then you can see this is the tympanic cavity, superior view of the tympanic cavity in which the auditory ossicles are seen, while this buried deep in the petrous temporal bone is the internal ear labyrinth. This is the internal acoustic meatus. Okay, internal ear as a vestibulocochlear organ, the main functions of the internal ear are twofold. That is sound reception and balance maintenance. We're going to discuss these two functions in detail in the next slides. Okay, now, anatomy of internal ear labyrinth. To cut the long story short, the internal ear consists of a ductal system of a fluid which is endolymph, fluid-filled intercommunicating sacs and ducts of the membranous labyrinth within an outer fluid perilymph-filled bony cavities or bony labyrinth. Now, if you have a look at this diagram, you can see that in the petrous temporal bone, this bone is the bony labyrinth. It has different parts we're going to discuss in the next slides. And this thing that I have outlined, you can see a blue colored ductal system which is lying inside this bony system, and this blue membranous ductus system is the membranous labyrinth, while this bony canal is all the bony labyrinth. Now, as we have already discussed, that the internal ear labyrinth is divided into two. Number one, bony labyrinth, which is shown in the above diagram, and number two is the membranous labyrinth, which is shown in the diagram below. That is the blue colored ducts and sacs. In the above diagram, you can see that the bony labyrinth is divided into a bony cochlea. This is the cochlea. This central cavity is the vestibule, and these three are the semicircular canals. In the diagram below, which is showing the membranous labyrinth, you can see that this thing is the cochlear duct, which lies within the bony cochlea. Then these bodies are the utricle and saccule, which are present inside the bony vestibule of the bony labyrinth. And third, these three are the semicircular canals or the semicircular ducts which are present within the three bony canals of the bony labyrinth. Okay? Where are the bony and the membranous labyrinth present, and what fluid are they filled with? The membranous labyrinth containing the endolymph is suspended within the perilymph containing bony labyrinth, either by delicate filaments similar to the filaments of arachnoid matter that traverse the subarachnoid space. I've tried to show you in the left diagram how the filaments extend in the subarachnoid space. Similarly, such delicate filaments are present within the bony labyrinth, which suspend the membranous labyrinth within the bony part of the bony labyrinth. Okay, these fluids, that is the endolymph and the perilymph, are involved in stimulating the sensory end organs for hearing and balance functions of the internal ear. So basically, we need to understand the location of the membranous labyrinth within the bony labyrinth. Now, the membranous labyrinth contains endolymph, while the bony labyrinth contains perilymph, in which in the perilymph is suspended the membranous labyrinth. Okay, and we understand this. Otherwise, we're going to discuss it in more detail in the coming slides. Okay, if we compare the perilymph and the endolymph, the perilymph is present within the bony labyrinth. It is like the extracellular fluid. It has high sodium, low potassium, ultrafiltrate of plasma, having low protein. While the endolymph, which is present within the membranous labyrinth ducts and sacs, it is like intracellular fluid. It is low in sodium. It is high in potassium, produced by stria vascularis of the cochlear duct, and it has low protein. Now let us consider the bony and the membranous labyrinth one by one. The bony labyrinth and the otic capsule. Now, what is this otic capsule? Let me tell you this. Just to revise quickly, this is the bony labyrinth, and the parts that it is showing are the bony cochlea, the vestibule, the semicircular canals. Now, bony labyrinth is a series of cavities contained within the otic capsule of the petrous temporal bone, filled with perilymph, which is extracellular fluid-like. Now, what is this otic capsule? Otic capsule is not the bony labyrinth. It is made up of bone that is denser than the remainder of the petrous temporal bone and can be isolated by carving the petrous temporal bone from the outer aspect of it. Now, this means that if we carve the petrous temporal bone, we find a deeper, more denser bone, which is the otic capsule, and within the otic capsule are the bony cavities of the bony labyrinth. Now that means the otic capsule outlines the bony labyrinth. Okay, so the bony labyrinth is the space or cavity in which the membranous labyrinth is suspended, the shape of which can be obtained by a cast of the otic capsule. Now, as I've told you, in the petrous temporal bone deep lies the dense bone, which is the otic capsule. And if we make a cast of the otic capsule, then that cast is the bony labyrinth. So I hope you understand the difference between the bony labyrinth and the otic capsule. Okay, the subdivisions of the bony labyrinth is cochlea, vestibule, and the semicircular canals, as you can see in this diagram. Now, first of all, we're going to discuss the vestibule. The vestibule is small oval chamber. It is about 5 millimeters long and contains the balancing apparatus, utricle and saccule. As you can see in the diagram below, in which we have made a section of the bony labyrinth, we can see that the vestibule is a small oval chamber. This and this. In the lower diagram, we've made a section. In the upper diagram, it is complete. Now, in the upper diagram, you can see that the oval window on the lateral wall is closed by the footplate of stapes. Okay. Now, the vestibule is ovoid in shape. It has got two openings in communication with the middle ear cavity. One of those openings is postero-superior and the upper opening is postero-inferior. The postero-superior one is oval in outline, and I've shown you that it is the oval window. It receives the footplate of the stapes. The other window is round and is called the round window, and it is closed by the secondary tympanic membrane. And like the other parts of the bony labyrinth, the vestibule also is filled with perilymph and communicates through a very narrow passage, the aqueduct of the cochlea, with the subarachnoid space of the posterior cranial fossa. I'm going to show you the aqueduct of cochlea in the coming slides. Now, in the lower picture, we've seen that we've made a section of the bony cochlea, and we can see an elliptical recess, a spherical recess, and a recess below. We can see three recesses. I'll show you which ones I'm talking about. Now, this is the spherical recess. It contains saccule, right? And it has foramina for branches of the vestibular nerve. Then the second recess is this elliptical recess. It also contains foramina for branches of the vestibular nerve, and there's a larger opening you can see in the center of this. This is the opening of the vestibular aqueduct. Okay, and the third one is this. This is cochlear recess. I'm sorry, I've made this circle a little larger. The cochlear recess, you can see it clearly now. So there are three recesses here. Okay, the communications with the semicircular canals posteriorly, the cochlea anteriorly, and communication with the posterior cranial fossa through the vestibular aqueduct. The vestibular aqueduct extends to the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone and opens posterolateral to the internal acoustic meatus and transmit the endolymphatic duct from the utricle and the saccule. The internal opening of the vestibular aqueduct for endolymphatic duct is seen here. Okay, in the center of this elliptical recess. Okay, this is another diagram showing you the recesses of the bony cochlea, and this is the spherical recess. You can see the foramina for the branches of the vestibular nerve. You can see the elliptical recess here. The spherical recess contains the saccule, and the elliptical recess contains the utricle. It has also got a central opening of the vestibular aqueduct, and this is fossa cochleophorimis. Okay. Now here in this diagram, you can see the external and the internal opening of the vestibular aqueduct. Have a look at this diagram. This is the vestibular aqueduct. Now, I don't want you to focus on the blue thing, just focus on the bony canal. This bony canal is the vestibular aqueduct, okay? It contains the membranous part of the vestibular aqueduct, which we're going to talk about in the next part of this presentation. Here in the left diagram, you can see the vestibular aqueduct is this. I'm sorry, I'm going to mark it again. This is the vestibular aqueduct, and this is the opening in the subarachnoid space in the posterior cranial fossa. This diagram is very important, this diagram, because it shows the bony labyrinth as well as the blue membranous labyrinth and all parts of it. So I really suggest that you have a look at it in the netters. This is very important. This is another diagram to show you the location of the internal ear deep in the petrous temporal bone, and I also want to show you, this is the internal acoustic meatus, right, through which passes the facial nerve as well as the vestibular cochlear nerve, which are the 7th and the 8th nerves, and posterolateral to this internal acoustic meatus, here is the opening of the vestibular aqueduct. Now, this is the temporal bone. This is petrous temporal bone, internal acoustic meatus, opening of the vestibular aqueduct. Okay, the next part is cochlea. The cochlea is the shell-shaped part of the bony labyrinth containing the cochlear duct. We say that it is shaped like the shell of a snail. It is a tube wound 2 3/4 turns round a central bony pillar called the modulus. Now, have a look at this diagram and you'll know what I'm talking about. This is the bony cochlea having 2 3/4 turns, or we can say 2 1/2 turn round a central bony pillar. This is the central bony pillar. This is called modulus. Okay. And we have next to this modulus, I want to tell you that this cochlear canal is a spiral canal which begins at the vestibule, makes 2.5 turns around the modulus with osseous spiral lamina. Now, what is this osseous spiral lamina? Osseous spiral lamina is a spiral bony ridge which projects from the modular surface of the bony cochlear canal and ends halfway through the lumen of the cochlear canal. As you can see in this diagram, this I told you is the modulus with canals for small branches of the cochlear nerve as well as small capillaries and blood vessels. Now, from this modular wall of the cochlear canal, you can see that a bony osseous spiral lamina extends. This is the osseous spiral lamina. This is the osseous spiral lamina. Right? It is seen here in different sections because it has been wound 2.5 turns around the modulus. So if you just want to have a look at one section of the cochlear canal, have a look at this. I've marked a bony ridge which extends halfway into the cochlear canal. Okay. Now, what is hemulus? If you talk about the hemulus, it is here a bony ridge which is the ending point of this osseous spiral lamina, and it also makes the boundary of an opening helicotrema. Hemulus is a bony hook, a bony ridge which makes the boundary of an opening hair helicotrema, because the osseous spiral lamina divides this cochlear canal into two halves. It extends halfway, the rest of the lumen has been closed by membranes, so it is divided like this. So there's a upper partition and there's a lower partition here. This upper partition is the scala vestibuli and this lower portion is called the scala tympani. Now these two portions, they communicate at the apex of this cochlea here, and that communication, that opening is called the hemulus. Okay. Now, as you can remember, we talked about the promontory of the middle ear cavity, the medial wall of the middle ear cavity. I told you that the promontory in the middle ear cavity has been made by the basal turn of the cochlea, and the basal turn is this. Okay. Now, at the basal turn, the cochlea communicates with the subarachnoid space through the cochlear aqueduct. As you can see in this small diagram, I told you that this is the vestibular aqueduct and this is the cochlear aqueduct. Both of these open into the subarachnoid space, the vestibular aqueduct as well as the cochlear aqueduct. Now the round window has been closed by the secondary tympanic membrane. We already talked about it. The membranous cochlear duct is present within the bony cochlear canal, the scala vestibuli and scala tympani. I told you that this upper division is scala vestibuli, this lower is scala tympani. Helicotrema is near the summit of cochlea. Here, near the summit of cochlea, the osseous lamina ends in a hook-shaped process, hemulus, forming the boundary of the opening of helicotrema. And then we have a spiral cochlear ganglion, which is also present and contains the primary cell bodies of the cochlear ganglion. Okay. Now the modulus, this is another diagram showing you the modulus. The modulus is the conical central axis or pillar of the cochlea. This is modulus. Its base is broad and appears at the bottom of the internal acoustic meatus. It is perforated by numerous orifices which transmit filaments of the cochlear division of acoustic nerve. Now, this is a little detail about the osseous spiral lamina, and as I've already described you this, There's nothing new in this slide. I told you that it reaches about halfway towards the outer wall of the tube and partially divides its cavity into two passages or scalae, of which the upper is named the scala vestibuli while the lower is termed the scala tympani. And the opening of the cochlear aqueduct in bony vestibule is this. Okay, in this section of the bony cochlea. Opening of the cochlear duct in subarachnoid space. This is another diagram showing you both the ducts. This is the vestibular aqueduct communicating the vestibule of the bony labyrinth, and this at the basal turn of the cochlea, bony cochlea, is the cochlear aqueduct. Okay. Now the third portion is the semicircular canals. Now there are three semicircular canals. Anterior, which is also called the superior semicircular canal, the posterior semicircular canal, and the lateral semicircular canal. Now all these three semicircular canals, they present at right angled, they make right angle, they are positioned such that they make a 90 degrees angle to each other. They're right angled to each other. So they're present on three planes of axis, X, Y, and Z. These canals connect with the vestibule. As you can see in this diagram, the anterior or the superior one, this is the anterior, we also call it superior, and the posterior semicircular canal. They have two limbs, right? One of the limb has been dilated, and this dilated portion is called the ampulla. Here is the ampulla of the posterior one, and this is the ampulla of the anterior or the superior one. Now here they just join each other and they open into the vestibule. This ampullary limb opens directly into the vestibule. Here also. And the lateral semicircular canal also has an ampulla at one end which opens directly into the vestibule, and the other limb also enters the vestibule. So basically there are 5 openings of the semicircular canals into the vestibule. Okay, and these 5 because one of the limbs is being shared by the anterior and the posterior semicircular canals. They just communicate with each other and they share a common limb which opens directly into the vestibule. So there are 5 openings. Okay, within these canals are present the semicircular ducts. Now the next is the membranous labyrinth. As you can see, it's a closed ductal system with sacs and ducts present, and the details starts now. It's a series of communicating sacs and ducts filled with endolymph, and it is divided into 2 portions. The blue membranous labyrinth, which has been shown in this diagram as blue. It is not actually blue. It is shown in this diagram as blue. This has been divided into 2 different portions. One of them is the cochlear labyrinth, the cochlear duct. This, and the other is balancing apparatus, the vestibular labyrinth, which is the utricle, the saccule, and 3 semicircular ducts and the endolymphatic duct. Now I'll outline this for you. This is the balancing apparatus, okay, and this is the hearing apparatus, the cochlear labyrinth. Now the balancing apparatus is further subdivided into two parts. This balancing apparatus is further subdivided into two parts. One of them is the semicircular ducts, which is meant for kinetic equilibrium or kinetic balancing, and the other part is this, which is the utricle and the saccule. The utricle and the saccule are meant for static equilibrium. We're going to discuss the kinetic equilibrium and the static equilibrium in the next part of this class. Okay, this is another diagram, and we've discussed this many times. Just for quick revision, this is utricle, this is saccule. These are semicircular ducts lying within the semicircular canals. This is the cochlear duct making 2.5 turns within the bony cochlea, 2.5 turns. This is the vestibular aqueduct, and this duct present is the endolymphatic duct present within the vestibular aqueduct. This is the cochlear aqueduct, which is communicating the subarachnoid space with the cochlea. Okay. Now the cochlear duct, we've started the membranous labyrinth. Now the cochlear duct is a spiral tube closed at one end. It is suspended in the bony cochlea between the spiral ligament, the osseous spiral lamina, spanning throughout the cochlear canal. The 2.5 turns of a duct with an apex and a basal turn around axis of modulus. This cochlear duct is triangular in section. There is a spiral ligament or stria vascularis. There is a vestibular membrane. There is a basilar membrane. Okay, let me mark these. Have a look at this. This is osseous spiral lamina of the cochlear canal. Now a ligament extends from the osseous spiral lamina to the lateral cochlear canal wall and makes this basilar membrane. From the upper part of this osseous spiral lamina extends another membrane, which is the vestibular membrane, and here the periosteal thickening makes another ligament, the spiral ligament, which contains the stria vascularis. Stria vascularis produces the endolymph. Okay, and this cochlear duct is filled with endolymph. Now let's have a look at another diagram where we can see these ligaments. Okay. Have a look at this diagram. This is the osseous spiral lamina through which there is transmission of the branches of the cochlear nerve. Then this osseous spiral lamina extends halfway through the lumen of the cochlear canal. From the edge of the osseous spiral lamina extends this basilar membrane and vestibular membrane, and this is the spiral ligament. So this triangular section is the section of the cochlear duct. It is also called the scala media, and we've already discussed that the cochlear duct divides this bony canal into a scala vestibuli and a lower scala tympani, which communicate at the helicotrema. The basilar membrane stretches from free edge of the spiral lamina to outer bony wall, thus dividing the cochlear canal into scala vestibuli above and scala tympani below. Perilymph within the scala vestibuli is separated from the tympanic cavity by base of the stapes and annular ligament at fenestra vestibuli. Fenestra vestibuli is the window. Okay, the oval window. Fenestra is the oval window, fenestra vestibuli, and the perilymph in scala tympani is separated from the tympanic cavity by secondary tympanic membrane at fenestra cochlea, which is the round window. Okay, now on the right side is the definition of the spiral lamina and the basilar membrane and the vestibular membrane or the Reisner's membrane. If you want to read this, you can have a look at this. Now, if we straighten up the cochlear canal, we'll look at this. This, okay, the scala vestibuli ends with oval window and the scala tympani with the round window, located in between the middle and inner ear. When the oval window moves, the round window moves in opposite manner. The basilar membranes moves too, and the waves propagate through the basilar membrane. We will discuss this transmission of sound through the internal ear in the next slides. Okay, let's have a look at the human cochlea. This is the middle and the posterior cranial fossa, showing you the petrous temporal bone. This is the temporal bone.
Its central axis is horizontally oriented in relation to the axis of the skull. The shell-shaped part of the internal ear.
Now let's have a look at the cochlea, the semicircular canals, the vestibule. The cochlea is 35 millimeters in length, and it is like the shell of a snail, as you can see. This is the basal coil, the apical coil, osseous spiral lamina. You can see this central portion. Now this is in this diagram you can see the section of the cochlea, in which the section of the cochlear canal and the cochlear ducts have been shown. The osseous spiral lamina have been shown. The basilar membrane, the vestibular membrane have been shown. The scala vestibuli above and the scala tympani below.
Like that of the motilus, is porous, allowing nerve fibers and blood vessels to travel within. The spiromodular artery and vein travel in the motilus and follow the spiral.
Okay. Okay, now let's talk about the vestibular system and the mechanism of balance and equilibrium. The vestibular system is an important part of the body balance and equilibrium, which is maintained by ears, eyes, muscles, joints, spine, together with the cerebellum. In performing this function, both ears work together. Stimuli keep passing from both the ears to the higher centers. The cerebellum interprets impulses from the semicircular canals, utricle and saccule, and maintains overall balance and stability. Now, the balancing apparatus, we already discussed this, that the balancing apparatus is being divided into two: kinetic balance and static balance. The kinetic balance is done by the semicircular ducts, and the static balance is done by the utricle and the saccule present within the vestibule of the bony labyrinth. Okay, the balancing apparatus, the kinetic equilibrium, semicircular ducts. The semicircular ducts with ampulla, sensory area, open into the utricle. Like the semicircular canals, the semicircular ducts also have 5 openings because one common limb is present between the anterior and the posterior semicircular duct. Each ampulla has ampullary crest, sensors for recording movement of endolymph in ampulla due to head rotation, hair cells of ampullary crest innervated by vestibular branches of vestibular cochlear nerve stimulate the primary sensory neurons of the vestibular ganglion in the internal acoustic meatus. This is the section of a semicircular canal filled with perilymph hair, semicircular duct hair filled with endolymph. Okay. Now, the balancing apparatus for static equilibrium is the function of the utricle and the saccule along with their ducts. The utricle and the saccule, as we've discussed earlier, labyrinth. The static labyrinth is formed by utricle and saccule and inform the brain of the position of head at rest or in uniform velocity because of the push or pull on the otolith membrane in the maculae of utricle and saccule. Just have a look at this diagram, which is hand drawn. I'm sorry if you find it complicated. Under conditions of health, when the head is erect or is in uniform velocity, equal number of stimuli pass from both sides to the higher centers, and the brain deciphers or translates this to assess the correct position of the head in space. As you can see in the above diagram, in this above diagram, you can see that the head is straight and equal number of stimuli pass from both sides to the higher centers. Now, if the head is tilted either to one side or forwards and backwards, like in this diagram, then the number of stimuli passing up to the higher centers is greater from the side which is lower and lesser from the side that is higher, because of the pull on the sensory organ. This difference of stimuli on both sides determine the position of the head in space at rest. Okay. Now, the kinetic labyrinth. As we can see in the hand-drawn diagram, the semicircular canals are 3 in number. They are the anterior, the posterior, and the lateral. Now, each semicircular canal is responsible for sensing a particular head direction. They're filled with fluid, and when displacement of this fluid occurs, nerve signals are sent to the brain informing about which direction the head just turned. The posterior semicircular canal detects when the head tilts towards the shoulder. The superior semicircular canal or the anterior semicircular canal detects when the head nods up and down, like in a yes movement, and the lateral semicircular canal detects when the head shakes side to side in a no movement. Now, the corresponding semicircular canals of the two sides, they work in the same plane, and they work together. The right superior or the anterior and the left posterior, they work together. I just repeat this again. The right anterior and the left posterior semicircular canals and ducts, they work together. Similarly, the right posterior and the left superior work together. For example, when the head is rotated in one direction, say from left to right, then in the left canal, the endolymph moves away from the ampulla, and in the right canal, the endolymph moves towards the ampulla. This movement of the endolymph towards the ampulla is ampulofugal. Okay? The stimuli are generated because of the inertia of endolymph, which stays where it is when the head is moved in one direction. And in this, by giving you this example, the right ampulla is stimulated and sends more stimulus towards the brain because of the ampulofugal flow of endolymph, and the brain deciphers or translates the head movement towards the right. Okay, now here in this video,
Deep within each ear, there is a balance.
I just want to focus the information that I just gave you. Let's have a look at it.
Called the labyrinth, composed of 3 semicircular.
These are the semicircular
These semicircular
canals,
are connected to the cochlea.
the vestibule, the cochlea,
Each semicircular canal is responsible
superior,
for
posterior, and lateral semicircular canals.
semicircular canal is filled with
Now
fluid.
this
Displacement of this fluid occurs
is
in the
the
canal.
posterior
Signals are sent to the
semicircular canal, which detects when the head tilts towards the
posterior semicircular
shoulder.
canal shown here detects
You can see the movement of the endolymph in the semicircular duct. Now this is the superior semicircular canal, which detects when the head nods up and down in a yes movement, detected by the crista ampullaris. And third and the lastly, the lateral semicircular canal detects when the head shakes side to side in a no movement. Okay? Now, these are the 6 steps of hearing. This is also very important, and it can be an important SEQ in the exam also. Number 1, the sound waves arrive at tympanic membrane. Number 2, movement of the tympanic membrane causes displacement of the auditory ossicles. 3, movement of the stapes at the oval window establishes pressure wave in the perilymph of the vestibular duct. 4, the pressure waves distort the basilar membrane on their way to the round window of the tympanic duct. 5, vibration of the basilar membrane causes vibration of the hair cells against the tectorial membrane in the organ of Corti. Information about the region and intensity of stimulation is relayed to the CNS over the cochlear branch of the cranial nerve. Okay, so these are the 6 steps of hearing process. The vestibulocochlear nerve, as you can see, this is the cochlea. The spiral cochlear ganglion is present, from which arises the cochlear nerve, and the upper and the lower divisions of the vestibular nerve. This is the vestibular ganglion. Vestibular nerve arises. Both these join to make the vestibular cochlear nerve, which passes through the internal acoustic meatus, enter the cranial cavity and into the brainstem. This is the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is the 8th cranial nerve. Now, the clinical aspects of the internal ear are that the injuries, number 1, the injuries of the peripheral auditory system may cause hearing loss, vertigo, or tinnitus. The vertigo is the dizziness, when you feel dizzy, and tinnitus is the buzzing or ringing in the ears. Now, the hearing loss can be conductive or sensory neural hearing loss. The conductive hearing loss results from anything in the external or the middle ear that interferes with conduction of sound or movement of the oval or the round windows, while the sensory neural hearing loss results from defects in the pathway from cochlea to the brain. The defects of the cochlea or the cochlear nerve or the brainstem or cortical connections can cause this sensory neural hearing loss, and cochlear implants are one approach employed to restore the sound perception when the hair cells of the spiral organ have been damaged. Motion sickness. Motion sickness is caused because we know the mechanism that the macula of the membranous labyrinth are primarily static organs which have small dense particles, the otolith, embedded among the hair cells. Under the influence of gravity, the otolith cause bending of the hair cells, which stimulate the vestibular nerve and provide awareness of the position of the head in space. Now, because this motion sickness results because there is discordance between vestibular and the visual stimulation. Now, lastly, Meniere's disease. The Meniere's disease is a disorder of the inner ear where the endolymphatic system is distended with endolymph. It is characterized by spontaneous episodic attacks of vertigo, sensory neural hearing loss, which usually fluctuates. There is tinnitus and often a sensation of oral fullness. It is a common cause of the syndrome of spontaneous vertigo, and despite this well-known symptom complex, it remains a controversial condition and often difficult to diagnose and treat. Thank you very much. I hope you understand the concepts of the internal ear.